Well, thank you for joining us for the Wemper Italian Theory speaker series. My name is Ren. I'm a PhD student here at the Center for Comparative Literature, if you don't know. And here's my co-organizer, Teresa. Teresa is currently an arts and science postdoc at the Department of Italian Studies. And as many of you know, a distinguished graduate from Complete. And we're so excited to have you join us today. I'll just say a few words about this year's theme and especially specifically for today's panel. So today's panel is titled Unnatural Motherhood and Reproduction. We ripped the first part off of Meghan's presentation title. Thank you, Meghan. It's inspired 3 wonderful abstracts we received. We want the space to reconsider what we often term motherhood and its social and biopolitical implications. The bare life of the mother/other to the intricate entwinement between social and biological reproduction. Each panelist finds a very creative way to address our normative relationship to gendered work and the cycle of capitalist extraction. So before we start, I'd like to thank both of our departments, Italian Studies and Complete, for your very generous support for this initiative. The series offers an opportunity to highlight not only Italian women philosophers, but also scholars who engage with and expand upon contemporary Italian theory in their work. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Patrick. Marshall teaches in the Department of Visual Studies at the University of Toronto. He has forthcoming publications in Cultural Critique, South Atlantic Quarterly, and Refocus, the Films of Leonard Fassbender. He is currently at work on a book project, Realism, Marxist State Theory, and the 1970s Political Thrillers of Costa Gavras. Welcome, Patrick.
Okay, thank you so much, Teresa and Ron, and Complete, and everybody else for being here. I'm going to allow that. Attempt to say something about the great 1986 Lizzie Borden film, Working Girl. Lizzie Borden's 1986, Working Girls, focuses on the story of Molly, a lesbian who lives with her girlfriend who has a degree, as the film makes clear, and who practices photography. To help make ends meet, she works as a prostitute in a Manhattan brothel run by the Madame Lucy, a character whose white-collar cultural coding could not be made more explicit than it is by her manner of dress seen here. Drawing on the aesthetics of cinema verite, the film lingers over Molly and the other prostitutes in the brothel, indifferently gazing upon the mundane, the communal, the sexual, and the social. We see Molly and her co-workers, all of whom are women, take clients, all of whom are men, and we see the tremendous differences between both the women and the men who populate this little ecosystem. Strikingly, the fact that this story of sex is told on film draws our attention to the proximity fee, yet it remains distinct from the conventions of the latter, where, for instance, the money shot, that is to say, a shot of male ejaculation, to take one example, had become a near universal convention of pornography from the 1970s onwards to signal narrative climax, according to Linda Williams. There's no such climax in Working Girls. The men we meet, moreover, are strange, cute, aggressive, and belligerent, but never is their power over the working girl fetishized by the film form. When sex is shown, moreover, always shown, as Borden puts it herself, from the woman's perspective. Between the film's many sex scenes, then, the film is suffused by the minutiae of working in the service industry. The girls fold towels, prepare food, order takeout, collect supplies, wait, and most importantly, talk shit about their boss and the various Johns that they serve. On one level then, and particularly through its emphasis on the work of sex work, the film upends conventional mainstream perspectives on sex work that have only been perpetuated in so many instances of sex work media. As Melissa Grant writes, for instance, it's common to invoke the prostitute as a metaphor for the most degrading aspects of exploitation under capitalism, forming what Grant calls the imaginary. It's probably equally common for us to assume what Heather Berg calls a kind of sex work exceptionalism, the treatment of sex work as if it is self-evidently exceptional. Let me start that sentence again. The treatment of sex work as if it is a self-evidently exceptional kind of exploitation. As Annie McClan and John Settle show, synthesizing the work of Grant and Berg, the prostitute imaginary and sex work exceptionalism suffuse not only popular culture, but leftist, even Marxist, writing on capitalism. In so many cases, prostitution functions as a metaphor for the yuckiness, they say, of in-person service work. While then it does not shy away from some of the darker and less flattering aspects of sex work, such as breaches of consent, cum-filled condoms, and blood-filled diaphragms, Working Girls is unique, however, not in its attempt to correct our flawed understandings or misunderstandings, as it were, of sex work. The film also constantly draws our attention to one crucial and inescapable of work under capitalism: the various ways that capitalism shapes time to meet the goal of surplus value extraction. More specifically, then, Working Girls is a reflection on the temporal dimension of the tension, concrete and abstract labor under capitalism. Work, in other words, must be done by concrete humans who wittingly or unwittingly undercut the capitalist's need to press labor time to a minimum. If this was not an obvious problem for capital period, Working Girls shows it is an unavoidable problem for capital in the era of deindustrialization, when the product is increasingly becoming not the production of a thing, but the delivery of a service to a human by a human. In order to understand what matter and how Working Girls helps us to make sense of them, I want to turn to account of the centrality of time discipline under capitalism, to a consideration of the ways that time discipline shapes the work of social reproduction in particular, before then turning to the film. Meekson's Wood has shown a new relationship between direct producers and time was crucial to the institution of capitalism, where, under the feudal mode of production, lords would extract a surplus from peasants through extra economic or coercive means, and would do so on the basis of their own wants, needs, or desires. Capitalism sees the institution of a system which depends upon increases of labor productivity. It's a qualitative distinction between feudalism and capitalism, which is also, in a way, a quantitative one. These increases of labor productivity in turn are motivated by a whole new set of economic imperatives, what Wood describes as quotes of competition, accumulation, and profit maximization, which are in turn possible by a constant systemic need to develop productive forces. Under capitalism, decisions about what gets produced, how much of it is produced, and how much time it takes to produce goods are no longer exclusively determined by the lords or the peasants. Instead, although choices about how workers work are enacted by capitalists, market imperatives of competition, accumulation, and profit maximization very strongly determine those decisions. Unlike the peasant, Susan Ferguson writes in this incredible book, who exercised some control over how quickly and when she hoed the fields for the Lord, baked bread for her household, and broke from her labor to eat and sleep, the wage worker is forced to adopt new forms of work discipline. Critical amongst these, then, is the worker's subordination to the new form of temporality that E.P. Thompson famously describes in his 19th article, Time, Work Discipline, Industrial Capitalism, where he distinguishes between pre-capitalist work rhythms of living and capitalist work rhythms. Here he writes, a general diffusion of clocks and watches is occurring, as one would expect, at the exact moment when the Industrial Revolution demanded a greater synchronization of labor. Where pre-capitalist labor is to be determined by the concrete determinations of a diversity of needs and desires, in keeping with the new emphasis on labor productivity, the new kind of labor processes that emerge under capitalism had to subject a diversity of labors to a common standard that would be measured by abstract clock time. In mature capitalist society, Thompson writes, all time must be consumed, marketed, put to use. It is offensive, he writes, for the labor force merely to pass the time, rather than, as he says, spend the time. Labor under the emerging industrial model, then, had to become faster to meet the new imperatives of the market, and the time that went into making a product had to become temporally quantifiable, therefore standardized. So those are the two impacts, according to Thompson, at least, that capitalism has on time and temporality. Marx, of course, also recognized the importance of a standardized conception of time to the capitalist mode of production. This was one of the conclusions that he drew in his study of technology of history from 1863, where he asks, what without the clock would be a period in which the value of the commodity and therefore the labor time necessary for its production is the decisive factor? How, in other words, can the diversity of commodities produced in diverse contexts find themselves commensurable on the market without a common unit of measurement? The answer to this is Marx's concept, worked out in Capital, of socially necessary labor time. That is to say, as Marx puts it, the labor time that is required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent in that society. In short, under capitalism, competitive force compel capitalists to reduce costs by pressing necessary labor time to a minimum and pressing surplus labor time to a maximum. Doing so would open a contradiction for Marx between concrete labor time and abstract labor time, where the former is the time it takes to complete a task and to produce what Marx calls, in the language of classical political economy, a use value, like a thing that you can use. Abstract labor time is the new socially necessary labor time it takes to produce something to be exchanged on it for the sake of valorization. Nothing then would render this notion more concrete than the rise of time-motion study that would be the form, or rather that would form, the basis of Frederick Winslow Taylor's practice of scientific management, whereby he would rigorously measure the time it takes a given task to be done before making recommendations to management to eliminate what he called waste motion, reducing of labor to the abstract form demanded by the market. Important then that although this new conception of time is demanded by the market, it is enacted by the capitalist and/or their managers. This attempt to dominate the time of direct producers through the imposition of a more abstract time then is one of the ways that workers who produce surplus value experience domination in the workplace. For this reason, it is also one of the important areas, or one of the most important areas of struggle, right, over time. As Thompson puts it, the onslaught from so many directions upon the people's old working habits was not, of course, uncontested. In the first stage, we find simple resistance, but in the next stage, as the new time discipline is imposed, so the workers begin to fight not against time, but about it, or about how it's used. Despite this, as Thompson argues, there are spheres of life that remain untouched by the imperative to maximize productivity through the standardization of time. The sphere of reproduction, standing outside of the imperatives of capitalist accumulation, while still remaining an important moment in the totality of capitalist social relations, is exemplary in this regard for Thompson. He gives the example of housework. The rhythms of women's work in the home are not wholly attuned to the measurement of clock. The mother of young children has an imperfect sense of time and attends to other human tides. She is not altogether moved out of the conventions, he writes, of pre-industrial time. In order to see what is at stake in viewing reproductive labor, specifically the temporal dimension of this work this way, in order to understand the temporal dimension of reproductive work under capitalism more broadly, we must take account of the way that Marxist feminists have come to regard the relationship between reproductive labor on the one hand and productive labor on the other. Across a diverse body of writing, the women who led the wages housework movement would come to argue that even though the housewife did not work in the factory itself, she needed to be entirely integral to the overall process of the production of surplus value. Put simply, without her physical and sexual contribution to the health of her husband, the process of surplus value extraction could not be carried out. In keeping with Mario Tronti's assertion in Factory and Society that all of society had been subsumed by capitalist logics, the thinkers and writers of Wages for Housework sought to argue that reproductive labor was similarly subsumed by capitalist logics of accumulation and was therefore every bit as productive of surplus value as factory work. Ultimately serves the same kind of function in that system. As Maria Rosa da Costa and Selma James write in The Power of Women and the Subversion of Community, what we meant precisely is that housework as work is productive in the Marxian sense, that is, as producing surplus value. So reproductive labor is just productive labor for them. Why, in other words, would we arbitrarily begin the value production process when the worker enters the factory gates, they ask. This redescription of housework as an integral part of the process of the production of surplus value had several important functions, right? Saying that reproductive work is productive work, or is, in a certain respect, serving the same function as it. It showed its practical in reproducing the wage-laboring male, and it politicized the work of housework. Demand wage for housework, in other words, was ultimately a demand that would provide the reproductive laborer, and the housewife in particular, in this specific formulation of it, a kind of political visibility that capitalists and leftists had not previously accorded them. Demanding a wage would force acknowledgement that just as men were exploited to produce surplus value in the factory, on this general level, so too were women exploited in the production of labor power. That's the claim of the thinkers and writers of Wages for Housework, one of the claims anyways. It would take the slightly later intervention of Leopoldina Fortunati to more explicitly make this case. In her 1981, The Arcane of Reproduction, which I have this amazing, the old cover for here, which Verso is printing a new copy of it now, and it has a really slick looking cover, but I like this cover. It looks like an old punk record. In any case, this is her book, The Arcane of Reproduction, Prostitution, Labor, and Capital. Here, Fortunati carefully traces the logic that I've just outlined. Working from the concrete instances of housework and prostitution alike, Fortunati writes that reproductive labor is capitalistically productive labor because it participates in, that is to say, makes possible, the reproduction of labor power through the production of use value, right, things that can be used, by the productive worker who consumes those things in order to then go to work to create surplus value for the capitalist. So this is all, the whole process is part of kind of overarching totality, or Fortunati. Housewives and sex workers, she writes, create not just value, but value and surplus value. Like their husbands and clients, they are reproductive laborers. This means in turn that just as other forms of reproductive work have a dual character, so too does reproductive work, whether paid or unpaid, for Fortunati. As she writes in this book, if reproduction work, like housework and prostitution, is then it goes without saying that it too must take on the dual character, being divided, for example, into abstract and concrete and abstract, assumed by all other work that produces value. Reproduction is not only concrete work, individually necessary and complex, it is also abstract human labor, socially necessary and simple. Reproductive work, in other words, produces both use values through concrete labor and exchange value through abstract labor, through participating in the category of abstract labor. Its participation in the circuit of value production, or does this through its participation in the whole circuit of value production, right? If you don't reproduce the worker at home, as many women do, Fortunati and others you don't get to complete the process of surplus value extraction. While the concrete work of making something, whether it is a hard good or an experience or a life, is one order of time, submission to capitalist logics of accumulation press the time down or push it into a particular form. Well, it is not entirely clear, as Susan Ferguson, I think, very compellingly points out in Women in Work, how certain forms of reproductive labor, like unpaid domestic work, can be productive when they are not measured and therefore not commensurable with other commodities. What is significant about Fortunati's argument is the way that it draws attention to the way that capitalism foists a dual character on reproductive labor. So we kind of have to one part of our argument in order to buy the claim that reproductive work does have this dual character of being concrete on the one hand and abstract on the other. While this dual character gives rise to a contradiction in any case, it is especially so when the labor is reproductive because, as Ferguson points out, the product of that work is life, and there can be no capitalist value attached to the product of life. Working Girls Recall is about labor that is at once reproductive and productive at once, right? It's about sex work that is productive insofar as it is paid work, and it's productive insofar as a kind of a class division in the brothel that Molly works in. We should have explained this more completely earlier, where Molly, as I'll explain towards the end of this talk, hands a kind of hands a literal surplus over to her end of her shift. So it's reproductive and productive. Girls it is about labor that is at once reproductive and productive. Reproductive because the girls reproduce the Johns. Productive because, as the makes abundantly clear, here's what I just explained, the working girls work for and under a man who exploits their labor to produce value. So it's reproductive and kind of like a little factory in a certain sense as well. By rendering a form of reproductive labor production, girls similarly raises questions about the place of reproductive labor in capitalism. How, for instance, does the capitalist imperative to increase productivity that Meekson's Wood rather identified as a kind of constitutive feature of capitalism, by imposing time discipline on concrete acts of labor, produce a series of tensions and contradictions? The film answers this question by drawing attention to the temporal dimension, so I want to argue, of work. So, let's see if this plays with sound. You just barely hear ticking of a clock, which is kind of important to what's happening, I think. The very first shot of Working Girls is a shot of a clock surrounded by photographs. A swift ticking sound overwhelms the soundtrack to emphasize the dominance of clock time. Rack focus renders the clock opaque, and the camera pans to Molly and her girlfriend fast asleep. It is Molly wakes up seconds before her alarm clock goes off. The implication seems clear. Molly has internalized the time discipline of the capitalist mode of production. From here we cut to a scene depicting the ordinary and concrete the reproduction of life. Molly and her partner work through their morning routine. They prepare their daughter for the day, and they gaze lovingly at one another across the breakfast table. We cut shortly after this to a scene, appear shortly, in which Molly is developing photos to establish this is her passion, photography. She then rides her bike to work, getting a coffee along the way. All of what we have seen so far, or up to that point, tied together by a kind of hauntingly fragmented drum machine and synthesizer soundtrack, which you begin to hear here. It's very peculiar. Which is interrupted eventually. I'll just fast forward to this part. Oh, no, I don't have that part here. Okay, so this goes on for a while. The soundtrack plays as Molly goes to work, and it's interrupted in a kind of harsh cut as Molly enters her place of work. And what cuts through when the song, or this kind of song ends, is the sound of a telephone. So Molly enters the brothel at that very moment. Over the course of the working day, the tension between embodied human messiness that the job like prostitution might make especially clear on the end, and the demand to render that process more efficient becomes clear. This tension is a thing that the film continuously makes a joke about, in fact. In an early sex scene, seen here, for example, we see Molly check her watch during the act of sex. The joke, I think, is not that sex work degrades a kind of sacred act. Rather, to follow the logic outlined above, it is to call attention to the fact that it is Molly's job to impose an abstract conception of time onto a concrete process. With her colleague, Dawn, makes this tension even clearer. And I will play this clip without speaking so you can see what happens.
Gene and I were there, so hurry up, okay? I don't want to put the phones on. Just hurry up.
Again, the film is a moral point here, I think, but a descriptive one. What happens when the body won't obey the limitations of abstract labor time? As David McNally puts it, the valorization process is a market-determined attempt to, quote, assume labor, to instrumentalize it, to strip it of all embodiment and subjectivity, which instantly runs up against its dependence on concrete, living labor, sentient, embodied thinking, self-conscious labor. In the work of social reproduction, because the product is a human life, and so there are two people involved, and because that product can be in ways that are contrary to the goals of capital accumulation, the tension is expressed even more strongly, as I think it is in this sequence, where this man just won't come. An important scene then occurs about 2/3 of the way through the film. In the middle of her shift, Molly is asked to pick up some supplies from the drugstore. After an interaction at the drugstore that makes clear her vulnerability, which I'm not an interesting one, Molly takes a walk through a public park where the camera focuses on children playing in a playground. Although the film frequently depicts the time of waiting for something to happen at work, it's not unusual for people to just be sitting around. In other words, this sequence feels particularly free of the dictates of time discipline that had hurried us through the last sequences that I described. The cinematography here is unique in the context of the film, moreover. When we're in the brothel, the camera rarely traces the motion of body through space. And so you've got a sense of what this scene looks like. this, in a way, is a typical kind of scene or way of filming what happens in the brothel with a really fixed position camera that doesn't move, right? It doesn't follow body space, in other words. When we're in the brothel, the camera rarely sees the motion of bodies through space. Rather, it remains stuck to the space of the brothel. The fact that the brothel is an apartment, only further cements the related sex work and housework that I think the film is partially invested in exploring. In this sequence, however, the one here, the camera ranges over space, panning, tilting, and following bodies as they navigate space. The fact that most of what children at play is also significant. It draws our attention to an experience of time commonly understood to be entirely outside the rhythms of time discipline. The camera, matching Molly's eye line while also zooming in, ranges over the various kinds of play and community we see in the park. The cut that happens towards the end of this sequence, that ends with the kind of ellipses, returns us to the brothel and expresses the tension that also suffuses the sequence we've just seen. Although the children enjoy a temporality that is outside of rigorous time discipline of paid labor, Molly witnesses this on her break. That time is ultimately used to regenerate her capacity to return to work, a point that is made even more forcefully by the presence of children who, in the lesson, will eventually be folded into the totality of capitalist social relations. Although the girls have engaged in a kind of class struggle throughout the film by, for instance, taking clients for an hour but marking them down as half-hour slots, the end of the event, a scenario in which struggle figures more prominently and directly. Just as Molly is about to leave for the day, Lucy asks if she can stay behind to cover someone on the night shift. Molly begrudgingly obliges. She takes a client who subjects her to verbal and physical abuse, and a client who asks her to quit and become a private client for him. Molly emerges exhausted, begging Lucy to leave, but Lucy pressures her again to remain until someone else can come in to cover her shift. The film then climaxes with a kind of money shot that I will play for you now. Here we see Molly tally up the value that she produced through her work, and note that what she's writing is amounts of money in the little notebook here, right? Not time, importantly, that she spent seeing John's, but money, amounts of money. Before dividing it into money she keeps and money that she must pass on to Lucy. In other words, the film tries to show us what the process of surplus value extraction looks like. In so doing, Molly draws Lucy's attention to the exploitation of her labor. Let's just wait a second to see how this plays out.
Molly, let's do money. April, we're square with money. Will you bring the trash down, please? Thanks. I am $20 short. Are you crazy? I have counted this money 6 times. Where's Mary? Mary is no longer with us. You know, you did very well today. See, it wasn't so bad. You made a lot of money. A lot of money for you. Lucy, have you ever heard of surplus value? Molly doesn't be patronizing. I went to a good school, too.
So,
Okay, babe, see you next week. No, you won't. I'm not coming back, Lucy.
so although it's kind of crude, and although Borden herself is kind of embarrassed of this sequence, she says so in the DVD commentary that I watched the other day. I think it's an important sequence because, in addition to making it entirely clear that the labor we have witnessed through the film is both reproductive and productive at once, right? She reproduces the Johns while producing money for Lucy, in addition to herself. In addition to stating in no certain terms that this is a film invested in questions of class antagonism, the sequence turns us to the tension between concrete and abstract labor, but through a new signifier, money. Although capitalism then needs the clock to measure concrete labor time, value constituting labor time, the form of labor peculiar to capitalism, and the product of abstract labor can't be measured before it is rendered commensurable, and it is money that we use to measure labor time. It is, after all, through the medium of money, not time, the capitalist squeezes value out of concrete acts of labor. As Marx puts it, money is the direct embodiment of abstract labor. In this sense, while the film has demonstrated to us the many ways that concrete labor resists being subsumed to the imperatives of market and abstract labor, money, as what Marx calls, oh, I read that sentence twice. So this completes the process. Here is the final sentence of the paper. Although the clock in the first scene that I showed you then seemed to represent something nefarious, the appearance of money at the end of the film might reframe our understanding of that first sequence. While the clock can be repurposed to meet the needs of socialized production, to measure various acts of concrete and useful labor, and I say that it should, I'm not anti-clock, money, insofar as it is a measure of value, cannot. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And now we've all heard of surplus value. Thank you. So our next speaker is Professor Meghan Sutherland. Meghan Sutherland's research draws on film and television studies as well as continental philosophy to consider the nature of the relation between politics and aesthetics in a range of different contexts, but with a special emphasis on television and avant-garde media. Professor Sutherland takes up aspects of this project in various essays and in her book, The Flip of Wilson's Show, which was published in 2008, but does so most directly in a book manuscript called Variety or the Art of the Popular, which she is now in the process of completing. So, welcome, Professor Sutherland.
Talking about the work of Elena Ferrante in small talk, presentation scale talk can be difficult. And I've run into this, I seem to run in this second time as a problem of trying to find a way to move between the different parts of this idea succinctly. And I almost did it, but I think I want to kind of try to jump ahead in what I've written to a part where I just want to talk to you about that I'm trying to develop out of the film, The Lost Daughter, which is an adaptation, of course, of Ferrante's 2006, I believe, novel, La Fille. And so as soon as the longer, talk that kind of preceded this one, or the longer essay rather, that's forthcoming in a volume of essays on Ferrante, I make the argument that her practice of authorship, her critique of authorship, this kind of discourse that she stages in a number of different forms through her novels, but also through her critical writing and essays, through interviews and popular publications, and basically a kind of array of different forms, is best understood not as a refusal of authorship, thank you so much again, but as a hauntology authorship that enacts a kind of feminist genealogy of lost voices and perhaps summons new ones. So we will go ahead and start. In the 2021 essay, Aquamarina, so let me just get this. In the 20, no, we don't want that, that's just there. In the 2021 essay Aquamarina, Elena Ferrante recounts the experience of reading Adriana Cavarero's Tu che mi guardi, tu che mi racconti, known as relating narratives in English, not for the first time, but the second. Ferrante's expressed reason for sharing this experience is to explain how Cavarero's treatment of the narrative character of female friendships, and that's Cavarero's phrase, helped her move from the solipsism of first-person narratives she had written for the female protagonists of her first three novels to the more complex, quote, double narrative of female friendship and mutual self-deformation that unfolds through the characters of Elena and Nila in the course of L'Amica Geniale, or My Brilliant Friend in English. Not mistakenly, the critical discourse surrounding Ferrante's work has made the relation between these two texts, and in turn between Cavarero's philosophical account of storytelling and Ferrante's literary account of double feminine creation, which is a phrase that Stiliana Milkova uses to describe it in the Neapolitan novels, a central part of its theoretical matrix. Or rather, it's made Ferrante's initial explanation of the significance Cavarero's argument holds for the novels, a virtual axiom for the feminist critique of authorship that numerous scholars have drawn from the interplay between the two. And so it should be. One can hardly dispute Ferrante's own account of the inspiration she drew from Cavarero's argument in the construction of her narrative, let alone her way of seeing actual stakes it carried. And there is, moreover, a lot to learn from the work that Milkova and Isabella Pinto and many others have done to elaborate the connection between the two even further. And yet, when read alongside Maggie Gyllenhaal's adaptation of Ferrante's novel La Figlia Oscura from 2006, a novel that Ferrante identifies with, quote, the dead end of her first-person narratives in that very same essay on Cavarero's argument, both Ferrante and the allegedly dead-end novel it seeks to break from take on a different kind of voice, with rather different implications for how we might think about the feminist import of Ferrante's authorial practice, not to mention the significance of Cavarero's work. As the first feature-length adaptation of one of Ferrante's novels to screen by a female director, and a novel that itself revolves around a literary theorist's avowed repulsion toward the double, and that's a quote from the novel, given to a doll by a mother and daughter at play, Gyllenhaal's The Lost Daughter provides an especially suggestive medium through which to retell the story of a woman who tells another woman's story. On the one hand, reading Gyllenhaal's film alongside Ferrante's writing and Cavarero's thought opens the way toward a feminist ethic of adaptation that builds something new from the deceptively simple conceit of both Cavarero's argument and Ferrante's twice-earned reenactment of it. As Ferrante puts it in brief, I tell you my story in order to make you tell me. End quote. On the other hand, such a reading prompts us to expand the relational terms that ground this ethic from the medium of storytelling that Cavarero elaborates into Che mi guardi to the variously scalar, embodied, aesthetic, and affective orientations of inclination that Cavarero develops in her 2014 book by the same name. A move that simultaneously dramatizes, complicates, and deepens the feminist affinities that draw Cavarero's thought, Ferrante's writing, and Gyllenhaal's moving images together into a reflection on the ethical bonds between women that no body can exhaust without the others. In order to flesh out the contours premise in the time I have here today, resounding as it does with the echoes of way too many other voices and names and ideas, including not only Ferrante's and Cavarero's and Gyllenhaal's, but also the quote, crowd of others they adapt along the way, as Ferrante likes to put it. I ultimately want to emphasize the distinct contribution that Gyllenhaal's film makes to the realization of this scenario, paying special attention to the variously aesthetic and embodied relations of inclination and disinclination that inhere between the women in telling of Ferrante's story. Or rather, by dwelling on Gyllenhaal's meticulous rendering of the polymorphic and emphatically carnal dramas of scopic relation, alternately connect, divide, substitute, repel, and subsume women and girls at the center of the story, defined as they are by the complex array of looking relations and affects the film stages between the bodies of mothers and daughters, actors and characters, readers and writers, matrons and sexpots, children and dolls, among others. The film's distinctly audiovisual resonance with the works of Ferrante and Cavarero does more than help us to imagine a feminist ethic of adaptation that is predicated on the work of intermedial and interpersonal relations. And this in contrast to the essentially genetic and biological relations and metaphors that prevail in theories of adaptation in its sort of surprisingly unproblematic way. It also helps embroider on the generative role that cinema stands to play in adaptations of feminist thought more broadly. But just as importantly, I think it opens the way to what I might call a postnatal understanding of the passage from ethical singularity to political solidarity through the curious figure of the unnatural mother. One way I hope to begin the singular task of plurality that confronts any feminism worthy of the name. Okay, so for a preliminary sketch that kind of became a central sketch of what I have in mind here, I want to work through this because I do think it helps to explain some of the ideas in play here, just to kind of give you a sense of them. more succinctly than some other ways of doing that. So I want to begin with a 2020 interview in which Cavarero discusses the reverberations between her and Ferrante's with the aforementioned Pinto and Milkova. And one reason to start here is that in the course of the conversation, Cavarero presents us with a remarkably concise overview of both the reverberations themselves and their more or less identical framing in Ferrante's studies. But the other reason to start here is that in the course of the same conversation, we find just as concise a display of what lies beyond this framing per se. Pinto launches the discussion by giving Cavarero a short introduction to her research on self-writing in contemporary literature, highlight the parallels she finds between Cavarero's idea of unicità and Ferrante's refusal to disclose her, quote, real biographical self to the commerciums of authorial presence, and those are her phrases. But she also touches on questions of narration, self-making, and so on in the context of online media culture. Cavarero's first response to this living act of intellectual autobiography is extended clarification. In my books, when I speak about the narratable self, and this is Cavarero, I insist on the narratable self as narrated by the other. This is our desire to be narrated from the mouth of another. Of course, this desire for narration can also be expressed by auto-narration or autobiographical fiction, but it's a narcissistic fallacy to postulate the self's self-sufficiency and its transparency to itself. When I talk about uniqueness in terms of narratability, I borrow an idea from Arendt and I adapt it for the purposes of my argument. That is, I underline the fact that the other woman is necessary for my story to be told. The meaning of the story consists also in the material operation of narrating the story that comes from woman. If there's anything in my work that may have inspired Ferrante, as I read in an interview in Vanity Fair, then it's the paradigm of relating narratives. With this clarification in place, along with having registered the strangeness of finding her arguments mentioned in the kind of glossy pop magazine we might find in a supermarket checkout line, Cavarero continues. It seems to me that especially in the four Neapolitan novels, Ferrante uses this kind of structure. The narrator, Elena Greco, is a woman who narrates the life of another woman, her friend Lila, and is narrating at the same time the lives of others and other visions of the other women. The two women have a very close relationship and produce biographical narratives of each other. Moreover, Ferrante discloses in a stylistically refined way that all four novels were inspired by Lila's essays, the paper written as a child. There is nonetheless a continuous exchange whereby each becomes narrator of the other woman, real or potential, a veritable poetics that in Ferrante's writing becomes a new literary genre that is neither purely biographical nor simply biographical. At the center of the plot is original subjectivity that is continuously in progress, continuously narrated, not only by Ferrante the author, but also by the two female protagonists of the book, who tell other their lives, their stories, which in turn are the stories of their relationships. Having offered up this spontaneous exegesis with which Ferrante adapts her philosophical concepts into popular narrative form, a reading that coincides just as precisely with the double reading of these works that prevails among Ferrante scholars, Cavarero shifts modes once again. Here, above all, that I think her meticulous rehearsal of this entirely convincing reading, sort of airless reading, starts to dramatize even more vividly that which escapes it. Striking a considerably more personal tone, she takes full at the unusual experience she's just described. Imagine my emotion. In reading Ferrante, I found the concept I theorized in my book, Relating Narratives. That is, the narrative relationality of the self, a concept I sought to live restrictive confines of the philosophical categories to which I'm unfortunately chained by my profession. I found it in Ferrante's work and in her ability as a storyteller, and this, to my mind, is the beauty of the book. You're directly involved in the narrative relation, and the relationship between Elena and Lila spellbinds you. End quote. Cavarero concludes this part of her remarks by underscoring what she takes to be the profound conceptual stakes of this translation, adding, when I talk about relation, I mean the relationality of concrete situations such as friendship, love, the mother-daughter relationship, and so forth. For me, Ferrante has grasped precisely this concrete, common, everyday relationality. We see it thematized in the relation between the two female friends and all the relationships as they vary by family or situation. There's always the concreteness of the other, of the narrator, of the relationality, and of the relationship. Symptomatically, only literature, only narration can show us this kind of relationship to the other. Philosophy can't show it. As a matter of fact, it neutralizes it. What a disagreeable profession I have. And that's the end of it. Whatever we make of the fairly stark distinction Cavarero draws in literary writing and philosophy, it's hard to ignore the complications posed by her decidedly personal way of making it. After all, what exactly are we doing here, if not immersing ourselves in the reciprocal narrative relation of two concrete women writers as they listen to and narrate one another's hard-earned intellectual lives, with each one giving a constitutive expression of the other's thinking yet fleshy existence in the very same gesture of telling it back to her in her own words? Is this not precisely the gift that leads her to respond to a question about the influence of her writing with such emotion? Seems to make her feel not simply seen, not simply heard, not simply read as a woman philosopher, but in fact adapted to an altogether different medium of existence, a less abstract one? And if so, should we really be looking at the living realization of Cavarero's argument inside the narrative economy of Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, whether or not it's doubled internally? Or should we instead be looking for it in the far more concrete expressions of recognition, relation, and heterodox self-articulation that accumulate in the narrative of feminist solidarities playing out around it? Maybe it's already obvious. I've devoted the first part of this talk to rehearsing the rehearsal, which is to say, to rehearsing Cavarero's philosophical rehearsal of Ferrante's literary rehearsal of Cavarero's philosophical argument. I think doing so compels us to answer these questions in the affirmative. I think doing so reminds us even more concretely than either Cavarero's argument or Ferrante's story alone, that their constitutive moment of the narrative relation they both eyes concerns Cavarero, Ferrante, and potentially their interlocutors, not only the characters they construct to allegorize their relation in philosophical dioramas and stories that already short-circuit the distinction between the literary and the lived and the thought. After all, Lila and Lenu, the much-loved characters at the center of the Neapolitan novels, are no more or less proper to this relation than Emilia and Amalia, the two women brought together in what I hesitate to call the original staging of this narrative in the landmark treatise Non credere di avere dei dritti, first published by the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective in 1987 and translated to English as Sexual Difference in 1990. Or for that matter, than Stein and Alice B. Toklas are in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Key point of reference in this ever-expanding and inherently interdisciplinary lineage of necessary others. But the point of all these rehearsals conflate either the people or their relationships they figure in some overarching trope of relational identification that collapses one into the other. Nor is it to conflate the telling of a life story with the telling of a living thought. Rather, it's to reproduce this relation with each slant-rhymed retelling, and in doing so, to redefine what counts as the matter of a woman's life story. Or even more simply, it's to make more necessary others in the breach between production and reception. With all of this in mind, and actually that was supposed to say production, reproduction, and reception. With all of this in mind, I want to put a critical mainspring of the feminist critique of authorship for which Elena Ferrante is rightly recognized has less to do with an act of refusal, which is to say with a refusal to perform the essentially patriarchal rights of authorship as an institution, as minister, and more to do with the ways in which her distinctive performance of those recasts them as a relational practice of feminist adaptation. Indeed, to the extent that Ferrante's published multiple volumes of nonfiction writing on politics of authorship, writing, and reading, including La Frantomalia in 2003, a collection of her columns on the subject from The Guardian called Incidental Inventions from 2019, and another series of lectures on the subject published in the margins in 2021, along with copious interviews in magazines, journals, and papers of all sorts, all of them signed under the pseudonym of Elena Ferrante, and all of them invoking the names of the various writers and thinkers whose works most inform her. And it makes little sense to argue that the point of all this drama is to demonstrate that, quote, authorial identity is unimportant, as one commentator puts it. Instead, it seems more fitting to say that Ferrante's tireless stage, what Milkova helpfully describes as a feminist genealogy of the texts and those who inform her own emphatically plurivocal voice, effectively recasts authorship as an ethic of adaptation, an argument I made at length in the essay I mentioned earlier. And so in the remaining time today, I want to turn at last to Gyllenhaal's 2021 adaptation of Ferrante's 2006 novel, La Figlia Oscura, for an indication of how this out in one singular instance of its practice, and what the latter might teach us, the engendering promise of interpersonal and intermedial adaptation that neither Cavarero nor Ferrante can on her own. In the spirit of kind of opening rather than closing this argument, I want to highlight three of the more fundamental ways in which Gyllenhaal's approach to the adaptation of Ferrante's avowedly dead-end story helps her out as a living thought. And the first and most obvious concerns the expressly relational discourses of production, reproduction, and adaptation that both Gyllenhaal and Ferrante exchange around the film. While it's a commonplace of feminists to treat the practice of production itself as an inherently ethical one, and to talk about that practice accordingly, it's rare to find an instance of this edited in the popular press between two women artists of such prominent stature, and it should suffice to say that neither Ferrante nor Gyllenhaal misses the chance to correct that. In an interview with The New Statesman, for example, Ferrante makes it clear from the sees Gyllenhaal's place at the helm of the adaptation as one with great significance for the feminist purpose of authorship that she's made the driving concern of her work. Noting that she gave Gyllenhaal free rein to make the work as she sees fit, and that quote, not have given the same freedom to a male director, she puts the politics of this choice as it turns, adding with a flourish or a swipe, "We've been in the male cage too long, and now that that cage is collapsing, a woman artist has to be absolutely." But is anyone familiar with Ferrante's steadfast investment in the popular elaboration of relational ontologies might expect, Ferrante is quick to qualify the basic notion of autonomy she has in mind here, making clear how sharply it's from the implicitly masculine qualities of abstraction and sovereignty that define the modern meaning of that concept, rife as it is, in her instance, with aporias at once aesthetic and ontological. The novel is elusive, she insists. As a filmmaker, you don't ever really possess it. You only get an idea of it, and you work on that idea. Quote. With this slightly prickly caveat in place, she offers a reflection on the notion of adaptation that comes straight from her meditations on the irreducibly relational nature of both hood and creative expression, musing, quote, "A good film taken from a good book involves not fidelity but invention. The goal is part of the book. If that is achieved, the most unfaithful film can turn out to be mysteriously to the text. It's what happened with Gyllenhaal. Her film seems scrupulously close to the book because it has the faithfulness of betrayal, the most productive and difficult types of faithfulness in life as well." And while Ferrante admits that some of these betrayals were, quote, painful to her as an author, she nevertheless takes care to stress that they're precisely what give the film a power distinct from the book, and yet in the same way crucial to its realization. In doing so, she spontaneously performs a relational theory of authorship that finds its necessary other in the mutually estranging relation of intermedial adaptation. But just as importantly, she foregrounds the distinctly feminist stakes of embracing such a thing, namely that every theory of authorship is also a theory of authority, and who can have it, and by extension, that an explicitly gendered and relational performative that shares the authority invested in that concept with another gives us an altogether different way of understanding what constitutes authority in the first place. One of the most striking things in Gyllenhaal's own performance of authorship is the rigor with which it answers to this ongoing investment in Ferrante's work. Indeed, in the countless interviews she gave to magazines like Time and New York as part of the customary rights of the global film industry, but amplified 1,000-fold by her illustrious career as a famous actress on the one hand and her debut as a first-time director dealing with a prominent author on the other, she discusses the work of authorship in ways that feel deeply engaged in philosophical and aesthetic underpinnings of virtually everything Ferrante has said subject in both fictional and nonfiction writings. In particular, of particular interest is the way that she talks about the material of acting as a kind of production and reproduction. She emphasizes at every turn in the press surrounding the film the way her own experience of working as an actress, and especially in The Deuce, mistakenly I guess is about sex work, made her want to direct. and how she brings that ethic to her space as a director. And she consistently thematizes the contribution that act in their own kind of moments of performative adaptation, how they intervene in the writing of the text. She gives similar pride of place, describing as another character in the and the person who gave her film. She accords this position to Hélène Louvart, the cinematographer for the film, and who she describes as having found in her use of an embodied camera by carrying the camera physically against her own wishes, in fact. And I want to describe, I think, the elements of embodied performance that inform the way we cast this film as well. But in order to turn directly to the film and to talk a little bit more loosely about what I'm seeing here, that I want to emphasize in the way that she adapts it aesthetically and the aesthetic contribution she makes through to the articulation of these issues, I just want to kind of move into what is kind of a pictorial account of this art that unfolds in my own kind of homemade stills of the film using my telephone and the TV screen, since Netflix makes it basically impossible to show either clips or to take a film any other way. So I've tried to kind of bring Gyllenhaal's own kind of work in this film and the way that she adds to this conversation directly into my by kind of indexing it here for you now. I think a particular note here, since we don't have much time to just kind of open these aspects of the film, is the way that she focuses on and the degree to which her careful attention to bodies foregrounds not just a theory of storytelling that might kind of come from many directions and come from an active relation, but in fact that dramatizes the relation of inclination and inclination, as I mentioned before, that unfolds by the women in these stories, evoking another one of Cavarero's prominent works that mention or attribute by title, but it feels palpably present by coincidence, by affinity, or by citation or reference or allusion throughout the film. The first, the kind of way I want to just highlight this approach to the rendering of the physicality of the actresses really foregrounds the bodies and all the connotations. It really invites our attention to the middle-aged body of Olivia Colman, who plays Leda, the aging academic. Leda is on vacation, as those of you who've seen the film know. Happens in a nutshell in the story is that, which is a story both Ferrante and Gyllenhaal make explicit, a story of watching. She watches a young mother on the beach, played by Dixon, playing with her child. This is the child and the mother who, as and before, Leda is repulsed by for the double voice they give this doll together in their play. And this is the scene where she enacts this repulsion to the double voice of the mother and daughter and all. And the way that she toggles here, the editing of this scene, I think is really indicative of the way she moves between what are bluntly physical renderings of the actors who play these roles, whose own kind of charged existence becomes a kind of textual register as well. And then she kind of coordinates this movement or this slippage between the act of objectification, of judgment, of evaluation, and of comparison from a spectator with these extreme close-ups to just a kind of psychological immersion or possible, escalation of the relation between these women. And I'm just going to flip through some of these images. These are in sequence, and we have Leda watching Dakota up close, playing with her daughter. Her daughter is lying on top of her, looking down at her. The camera cuts back to Leda, and she's here looking on in some kind of growing state of unease that we don't get to know. We cut back to her view of the mother and daughter playing together, and back to Leda again. In each case, the relation becomes more despairing. But these ups, I think, and the way that Gyllenhaal edits this constant interplay between the removal and the physicality of the actress watching, and then the physicality of the actress being watched, and her explicitly kind of sexualized body, and also her as the daughter of a famous starlet, Melanie Griffiths and Don Johnson, right? This progeny of celebrity relations, a famous daughter, let's say. Um, she looks on in horror from an impossible viewpoint that I think really aligns the film with a kind of classical passalance of the cinema of poetry. That's an impossible point of view that actually invites us to identify in the moment of refusing it and focusing on the concreteness of the embodied relation between the two women. It despair. And as Leda gets up and rushes away to collect herself, we are treated to a kind of strong distinction to, or kind of display of her body in a bathing suit that raises the question of whether she is lost her appeal as a woman or whether it's something about the with the child. Now, because I'm out of time, I want to just, and I haven't even touched on the figure of the unnatural mother yet. I just say a few more words about this as a staging of inclination, because it is inclination between these women, but also a kind of growing disinclination, a kind of aversion we see come out. And I think one way to understand the staging of these kinds of intimacies, which are also played repeatedly with the children, and the staging of a younger Leda remembering herself, playing with the daughters as children. We eventually find out that she abandoned her daughters, and this is the source of her despair, right? And as we go on kind of experience of this, I think we really see how much a kind of Cavarerian kind of relation of inclination, this quality attributed to women, and I actually do have a slide, but I know I'm out of time, does indeed in the way, although Cavarero kind of do a sense of her writing on inclination. Yes. In inclinations, I'll just say so that we can talk about it in the Q&A, that Cavarero talks about ways in which, next to the paradigm of the vertical axis, appropriated by man because inborn rationality, appears the paradigm of an oblique line reserved to woman because of a constitutive predisposition to maternity, which causes inclination. It is, of course, indisputable that we're speaking here about outdated stereotypes. The schema works precisely by emphatically and repeatedly proposing conventional characteristics of the two sexes. But looking closer and through a philosophical frame, we see paradigms referring to two different models of subjectivity, two theaters for questioning the human condition in terms of autonomy or independence, two styles of thought, two languages. The first relates to individualistic ontology and the second to ontology. Given that two sexes are in question here, the problem is so much, or not only, to contest the absoluteness of the vertical axis, but also to free inclination from its normative command and its defining grip. And basically, I guess I'll just conclude by saying that I really think in a way that Gyllenhaal attends to the violences and the kinds of judgment that slip between the specular and the relational, or the embodied and the abstract, through the process of inclination itself, was, of course, the kind of risk attributed to inclination by Cavarero, this stereotype of women getting carried away with desire, with love, losing themselves, or being unable to control or to reason their will. I think what we see here is that that is the point that makes an unnatural mother recoil in some way. The kind of risk of subsumption by the child, by the way in which relation slips into subsumption in the process. And that may be what an unnatural mother, or the figure of the unnatural mother that she enacts in the film, which is quite different from the one that Cavarero, or that Ferrante does, her betrayals. that she opens the way to thinking about the figure of the unnatural mother as a kind of biological relational figure of the maternal that is rooted in inclination, that is a mother essentially with limits, a mother who is disinclined to always give herself to the inclinations of her children. And so it also like spreads into an erotic life as well, eventually becomes unsatisfying for Leda in the course of the film. So I think that the point of the figure of the unnatural mother, to conclude, is just really that I think it takes the relation of reproduction and the creative moment of it and the difference of it out of this biological framework in a way that's especially generative right now, as we kind of other ways than the biological to define the woman and who listens to her, and to renew this relation in terms of a kind of attention, a way of inclining towards women and women's stories and telling women's stories, no matter one's sex, a way that reflects that felt lived fullness. So.